Welcome back, everyone. So, last week we explored the rise of the novel in the 18th century from its origins in romance. This week we're going to be discussing two other genres that arise out of the romance tradition, and that is fairy tales and Gothic stories. So, this video is going to be discussing fairy tales in preparation for your reading of Madame de Beaumont's Beauty and the Beast and Angela Carter's The Tiger's Bride. In particular, I'd like to do three things in this video. One is I would like to define the genre of fairy tales. I'd like to briefly go over the history of fairy tales in order to locate Beaumont and Carter. I want to provide you with some background on Beaumont and Carter and also with some information about fairy tale traditions. So let's take the first issue, which is the definition of fairy tales. Fairy tales basically are short fictional stories. They are stories that frequently utilize supernatural elements like ghosts or goblins or fairies or magic. They oftentimes have sort of very improbable events that take place, and they oftentimes are associated with children. In fact, you may be most familiar with fairy tales through watching Disney videos. Um, Now, fairy tales from this definition actually sound a little bit like romance, but there's some crucial differences between fairy tales and romance. Romances tend to get associated with wealthier audiences, and romances tended to pass more quickly into print or manuscript circulation. Fairy tales, by contrast, are oftentimes associated with folk culture. That is, with people who are not wealthy, who live in small villages. And though fairy tales are not necessarily written down, fairy tales actually begin historically by being passed down orally from one storyteller to the next. Because of this, fairy tales oftentimes do not have an original author. Um, Although we are going to be reading two fairy tales that do have an original author. Or where an original author exists, oftentimes it's someone who has inherited a whole set of stories and has then rewritten them, edited them, made them their own, and then published them. So, a lot of where fairy tales kind of fall in terms of whether they are told orally or told in writing depends on what's going on historically. So, I want to give you a timeline to show you the evolution of fairy tales, and then we're going to place Beaumont and Carter within this evolution. All right, so what I've created for you guys is a historical timeline to show you the way that fairy tales change over time. What you can see on the left-hand side is a purple box that says pre-1700s. In pre-1700s, fairy tales are told orally to mixed age audiences. That means both children and adults. Those stories aren't written down. They tend to get passed down from generation to generation. And typically, what happens is there are certain staple elements within particular tales that a storyteller will learn, and then that storyteller will add in, sort of their own flair or their own interests. So, for example, there are several different versions of the Little Red Riding Hood story. And depending on what version you have, you may end up with a version that's extremely moralistic. You may end up with a version that's really violent. You may end up with a version that is this really racy, but they're all going to contain sort of similar elements. They, usually invoke a little girl wearing, some kind of a hooded cloak, carrying stuff to grandmother, grandmother getting eaten by a wolf. Now, as this suggests, pre-1700 fairy tales actually tend to be pretty explicit. So they're either sexually explicit, they're super racy in terms of the language that they're using, and they may even be violent. Now, the middle box is what happens to fairy tales in the 17 to 1800s. So in the 17 to 1800s, fairy tales begin to pass from oral telling into print publication. So what happens is you sometimes will have editors that will gather fairy tales, like the Grimm's brothers, and then write them down, publish them, and then actually begin revising them. Some other authors will have heard the story and actually write it down into a print publication version. So when that happens, there's a few changes that take place. One is that the audience for fairy tales changes as they get written down. Fairy tales are no longer then at this point told to primarily mixed age, mixed class audiences. They tend to get written for either wealthier audiences or for children, which is what we're going to see in the case of Madame de Beaumont. Because the audience changes, then the function of fairy tales changes as well, and so does the writing. Fairy tales that get written down tend to have a much more explicit moralistic purpose and educational purpose. And in addition, the tales tend to become much less sexually explicit. All right, so the last box is the green box, which shows you what happens to fairy tales in the 1900s to 2000s, because there's another shift in these tales. Um, the first and probably biggest one is that the audience for fairy tales becomes really bifurcated by the time you get to the 1900s and early 2000s. Um, you know, Groups like Disney create fairy tales in film version, and then other authors create them in publication version, but entirely for children. So the purpose of fairy tales that are written for children becomes one of entertainment. Um, and then at the same time, or perhaps slightly later, fairy tales get co opted by feminist writers like Angela Carter for actually adult audiences. And the purpose of these fairy tales then is typically to comment on society. And someone like Angela Carter actually comments on women's conditions and women's positions within society, both today and also historically. So, as you could tell, this kind of evolution is exactly what happens to the Beauty and the Beast tale. Beauty and the Beast actually arises from a story tradition that goes as far back as the classical Cupid and Psyche story. Um, in Europe, though, it passes into a literary version in 1740 by Mademoiselle Gabrielle Suzanne de Villeneuve. Villeneuve's version becomes the source for Madame Marie Le Prince de Beaumont's version, which is written in 1757 and published in her book called Les Magasins des Enfants. In English, that literally means stories for children. Now, we're going to be reading Madame de Beaumont's version, and that version is really noteworthy because it is written explicitly for children. And it seeks to teach children, especially young women, the importance of mainstream social ideologies about gender. In particular, she seems to be trying to teach young women the importance of things like obedience, good manners, and virtue. In this sense, her stories function as what Angela Carter has called parables of instruction. Now, Angela Carter's The Tiger's Bride is basically another version of the Beauty and the Beast story. Her short story is actually part of a larger collection called The Bloody Chamber and Other Stories, which was published in 1993, so a couple hundred years after Beaumont. And it rewrites the story of Beauty and the Beast in order to comment on women's roles in society, in particular, their role as being subservient to men. So her story, in fact, shows how one young woman negotiates the fact that she's socially and economically a material possession to be passed around to men. But then her book also provides a commentary about sort of the fictionality of Beauty and the Beast itself as a story. So it comments on things like reality versus fiction. So that's the background and history of Beauty and the Beast. And we're left with a question, which is how should we read Beaumont and Carter, um, you know, for this week? So because fairy tales are so adaptive, scholars tend to study them in two ways. One, they study their cultural function, that is, what purpose do they serve being told to society? And then two, they can study their format. They can study the formal elements of the work. So let's talk about cultural function. Fairy tales allow audiences in general to negotiate real tensions that exist in their own community. And the fairy tales can criticize, can criticize these tensions. They can reinforce social rules. They can compensate for social rules. And they can also provide a place to lament social rules as well. And some of the things that fairy tales may comment on include things like rules and practices surrounding gender, marriage and courtship, and even familial relations like parent child relations. Um, so that's the cultural function. Let's think about how we can comment on format. Because Beaumont and Carter adapt what we call the conventions of the Beauty and the Beast story. When I say conventions, I mean it in two ways. First, is a convention is an umbrella term for things that we come to expect. So in our daily lives, conventions refer to culturally accepted ideas and practices that are so prevalent that we just do them as a matter of course without thinking about them. Um, so when the convention changes, that's when we begin to notice it. And I'll give you an example. 100 years ago, it was conventional that women didn't work after marriage. That following marriage, they would focus on raising children and being a wife and running a household. That is no longer the case today. And yet we still see vestiges of that convention embedded within our own institutions. Is in fact one of the reasons why one could argue that an average public school day runs from 8:15 or 8 o'clock in the morning to about 3 o'clock in the morning, even though the average schedule for most working American adults is 9 to 5. What we have there is a mismatch of timelines based on a convention, a social convention that women would not work after marriage. Now, in literature, a convention can also refer to a rhetorical feature that gets used so often that we begin to identify it with certain kinds of stories and expect it to be there. And this is particularly true of fairy tales. So, fairy tales have certain things that they do and say that we have just come to expect. And when it's not there is when we notice it, or when it seems, when it's been edited, then we notice it. So I'll give you a very common example. Fairy tales oftentimes open with the line "Once upon a time." When you read "Once upon a time" in a work, you know that you're in the genre of a fairy tale. And when you don't see it, then you typically expect that you're not in the genre of a fairy tale. So for a fairy tale author to withhold that conventional opening is a signal that they're trying to do something with your expectations for fairy tales. Um, Now, when it comes to all fairy tales, each fairy tale, in addition to having certain rhetorical tropes, also has certain plot features that we've come to expect. So, for example, in the story of Little Red Riding Hood, as I mentioned, we expect that that story will include a young girl who's wearing some kind of a cloak, a wolf who tries to trick her, and typically a kind of common rhetorical conversation where Little Red Riding Hood says, "My grandmother, what big ears you have," and then the wolf replies. All right, so those are two ways that we can think about conventions. Here's some things that I want you to think about when we're reading Beaumont and Carter. What conventions does Beaumont establish in the Beauty and the Beast story? And how does Carter revise those conventions? And two, what does each story teach us about gender? In particular, women's role in society, that is, in the society in which those authors are writing. All right, I look forward to seeing your answers on the discussion board. Please let me know if you have any questions.